History is full of facts that survived for centuries, mostly because they sounded cool, looked dramatic, or made somebody powerful look better. In this video, we're dragging 32 of those legendary lies into the daylight, from fake torture devices to myths so widespread they still get repeated like sacred truth. Some are ridiculous, some are sneaky, and a few are honestly embarrassing. 1. The English did defeat the Spanish Armada, but not in the neat, glorious way schoolbook paintings love to suggest. The sea battles themselves were more annoying than decisive. English ships stayed mobile and kept peppering the Spanish from a distance, while the Spanish had bigger vessels loaded with soldiers but far less agility. Nobody delivered some clean cinematic finishing blow. The real executioner was the weather. Once the Armada tried looping around Scotland and Ireland to get home, storms tore the formation apart, smashed ships into hostile coastlines, and turned retreat into a floating nightmare. Men died from hunger, thirst, wrecks, and disease. England won, yes, but the final knockout came from wind and water, not some perfect naval masterclass. Nature landed the punch. England grabbed the trophy. 2. The Iron Maiden is basically the history version of a fake movie prop that somehow fooled generations. That famous spiked coffin people associate with medieval torture was not a real medieval device. There is no solid evidence it existed in actual medieval practice. It showed up much later, mostly in the 19th century, when museums and showmen realized that horror sells. So they dressed up the Middle Ages as one giant barbaric nightmare, built creepy contraptions, and let the public gasp in disgust while paying for tickets. The Iron Maiden fit perfectly: dramatic, nasty-looking, and completely marketable. Medieval Europe had plenty of real torture methods, unfortunately, but this one was more Victorian imagination than medieval reality. So yes, one of history's most iconic torture devices was basically a grim little tourism scam. 3. The whole carrots help you see in the dark thing sounds like wholesome grandma wisdom, but it was really a very slick wartime lie. During World War II, Britain had radar, which gave its pilots a huge edge in night combat. German forces were understandably concerned about how British pilots kept finding bombers in darkness like they had cheat codes installed. Britain needed a cover story, so it pushed the idea that these pilots had amazing night vision because they ate loads of carrots. Newspapers repeated it, posters sold it, and the public swallowed it whole, probably with a side of boiled vegetables. Carrots do contain nutrients that support eye health, but they do not magically turn you into a nocturnal sniper. This was propaganda with a vegetable costume, and somehow parents are still recycling it generations later. 4. Pandora did not open a box. She opened a jar, a big one. In the original Greek story, the container is a pythos, which was a large ceramic storage jar used for practical things like oil, grain, or wine. Not some cute little mystery box you'd casually flip open because curiosity got bored. The box version came later thanks to a translation slip in the 16th century, when Erasmus used a Latin word meaning box instead of the original vessel. And somehow that mistake stuck harder than the actual myth. It matters because the image changes completely. A box feels small, personal, almost delicate. A giant storage jar feels heavier, stranger, and a lot more dramatic. Pandora was not opening a jewelry case. She was lifting the lid on something closer to an ancient pantry monster. 5. The Pilgrims did not sit down once, invent Thanksgiving, and then launch a permanent American tradition like they were founding a turkey-based religion. They held a harvest feast in 1621 with the Wampanoag, and that was not the beginning of a yearly national holiday. The Thanksgiving, people recognize today, was really shaped much later, especially in 1863, when Abraham Lincoln made it a national observance during the Civil War. He wanted a unifying tradition while the country was tearing itself apart, which is about as far from the Pilgrims as you can get without adding football. Before that, Thanksgiving celebrations were inconsistent, local, and all over the calendar. The neat founding story version was built later because nations love a tidy origin myth. The Pilgrims contributed a meal. Lincoln turned it into a ritual. 6. Those gleaming white Roman statues in museums are lying by omission. Ancient Romans did not admire plain white marble the way modern people imagine. They painted their sculptures, and not timidly either. We are talking bright colors, skin tones, red lips, vivid clothing, and decorative details that could get surprisingly bold. To Roman eyes, a bare marble statue would have looked unfinished, maybe even weirdly lifeless. But over centuries, the paint wore away, leaving the stone underneath and fooling later generations into thinking that blank whiteness was the original aesthetic. Then Renaissance artists copied the mistake, and Western art spent a very long time worshipping accidental paint loss. Modern analysis can now detect traces of pigment, and reconstructed statues show a world that was far more colorful than the museum version. Classical beauty was not born monochrome. Time bleached it. 7. The 100 Years' War is one of history's most confident examples of naming something incorrectly and then just never fixing it. It did not last 100 years. It lasted 116, from 1337 to 1453. Apparently, once the label sounded nice enough, nobody felt compelled to consult a calendar. To be fair, it was not one non-stop war with swords swinging every day. It was a messy stretch of campaigns, truces, resumptions, and political chaos between England and France over dynastic claims. Still, even with breaks, the number is wrong. Calling it the 100 Years' War is like selling a 12-piece meal and slipping in 16 items because arithmetic gave up. People living through it did not use that name anyway. Later historians needed something catchy, and accuracy clearly lost the argument to branding. 8. The katana gets treated like the soul of the samurai, the ultimate battlefield weapon, the thing that supposedly defined Japanese warfare. Great story, not really true. On actual battlefields, samurai relied far more on bows and spears. The yumi was prestigious for centuries, and the yari was brutally practical in formation fighting because, shockingly, having more reach is useful when everyone is trying not to die. The katana mattered, but mostly as a sidearm or backup for close quarters when your main options were gone. Its legendary status really exploded later during the long peace of the Edo period, when samurai were less busy fighting wars and more busy becoming administrators with a polished warrior identity. Sword culture became philosophy, status, and nostalgia. The battlefield reality was less poetic. Spears and arrows were doing a lot more of the actual work. 9. Not every pirate eye patch was covering some dramatic missing eye from a cannon blast backstory. Sometimes it was just smart planning. A ship had two completely different lighting worlds, blazing sunlight on deck and near-total darkness below deck. Human eyes do not switch between those conditions instantly. Full dark adaptation takes time, and pirates in the middle of a raid were not exactly in a position to pause for 25 minutes and let biology catch up. So one simple trick was to keep one eye covered with a patch, letting it stay adjusted to darkness. Then when going below, switch the patch and suddenly you can actually see where the loot is instead of stumbling around like an idiot. Yes, some pirates absolutely had real injuries, but the eye patch was often less pirate fashion and more low-tech combat optimization. 10. Vikings were many things, and a lot of those things were terrible, but filthy cave-level hygiene monsters is mostly a smear job. Archaeology suggests they were actually unusually well-groomed by medieval standards. They bathed regularly, often once a week, which at the time was practically luxury spa behavior compared to many of their European neighbors. They carried grooming tools too, including combs, tweezers, and ear-cleaning implements, which is not exactly the kit of someone committed to living like a swamp creature. Some even used strong soap to lighten hair and beards. Medieval English writers complained that Viking men were too clean, too stylish, and too successful with local women, which is honestly an incredible historical insult. Much of the dirty barbarian image comes from Christian chroniclers who had every reason to portray pagan raiders as disgusting animals. Violent, yes. Unwashed by default, no. 11. Knights in full plate armor were not helpless tin cans wobbling around until someone tipped them over. That image survives because movies adore making armor look like a wearable prison. In reality, a full suit of plate was heavy but intelligently distributed across the body, usually around 50 to 60 pounds. That is a serious load, but not remotely impossible, especially when it is custom-fitted by experts who understand movement, balance, and joint flexibility. A properly armored knight could run, climb, mount a horse, fight effectively, and generally move like someone preparing for war rather than someone trapped in kitchenware. Modern reenactors in accurate replicas have shown just how mobile this equipment really was. The confusion often comes from tournament armor, which could be heavier because sporting events allowed for less flexibility. Battlefield armor had one job: keep you alive without turning you into furniture. 12. Yes, George Washington grew hemp, and yes, it is the same species people love bringing up with a smug little wink. But no, this does not mean the first president was out there treating Mount Vernon like a colonial smoke lounge. Hemp in his world was valuable mainly as an industrial crop. It was used for rope, sailcloth, and other practical materials that mattered enormously in an economy tied to shipping and agriculture. Farmers grew it because it made sense, not because they were chasing a mellow evening. There is no reliable evidence that Washington was using it recreationally. The varieties cultivated for fiber were not the same thing people imply today anyway. Colonial elites definitely consumed intoxicants, but alcohol was doing most of the heavy lifting there. So, technically true? Sure. Interpreted the way internet memes want it understood. Not even close. 13. Walking the plank is one of those pirate images everyone knows and almost nobody should trust. As a routine pirate punishment, it is basically fiction. There are maybe a couple of vague references that might resemble something similar, but the popular version belongs far more to adventure stories than to real pirate practice. Actual pirates were criminals running dangerous, fast-moving operations. If they wanted someone dead, they usually chose methods that were immediate and efficient. They were not in the business of staging theatrical little morality plays on a wooden board while the Navy was potentially closing in. Walking the plank is famous because it is dramatic, visual, and delightfully cruel in a made-for-entertainment way. It gives villains flair. Real piracy was nastier, quicker, and generally less interested in choreography. The legend survived because it looked fantastic in fiction, not because pirates loved elaborate execution rituals. 14. Samurai did not reject guns in some noble fit of sword-loving purity. Quite the opposite. They saw firearms, recognized that bullets are extremely persuasive, and adopted them with impressive enthusiasm. When matchlock guns arrived in Japan in the 16th century through Portuguese traders, Japanese warlords wasted very little time embracing the technology. Firearms were copied, mass-produced, and built into military strategy at remarkable speed. Within decades, Japan had an enormous number of guns, and major armies were reorganized around their use. This was not a civilization stubbornly clinging to steel while modernity knocked at the door. It was a ruthless military culture taking whatever worked best. The later image of the samurai as a sword-obsessed traditionalist grew stronger during peacetime, when sword culture became identity, symbolism, and philosophy. But in real warfare, samurai were perfectly happy to modernize when modernizing killed enemies better. 15. Shakespeare did not write in Old English, no matter how many people say it with complete confidence. He wrote in early modern English, which is why his plays are difficult sometimes, but still mostly understandable with a little effort. Old English is a very different beast. It is the language of Beowulf, and to modern readers it looks less like antique English and more like a linguistic ambush. Shakespeare is much later. His phrasing may sound fancy, theatrical, and occasionally determined to start a fight with your attention span, but it is still recognizably English. The timeline matters. Old English came first, then Middle English, then early modern English. Lumping Shakespeare into Old English erases centuries of change. It is a bit like seeing an old photograph and deciding everyone in it must be ancient Romans. Old, yes. That old, absolutely not. 16. James Cook did not discover Australia unless your definition of discovery includes arriving absurdly late to a place that was already occupied and partially mapped. Indigenous Australians had been living there for tens of thousands of years before Cook showed up in 1770, which rather undermines the whole discovering angle. Even from a purely European point of view, Cook was not first. Dutch explorers had reached Australian shores in the early 17th century, and later Dutch navigators charted parts of the coastline under the name New Holland. What Cook actually did was map the eastern coast in detail and claim it for Britain, which made his voyage politically important because it helped launch British colonization. That is historically significant, yes. But significance is not the same thing as discovery. Australia was not some hidden island waiting for Cook's dramatic entrance. It was already there, very much known. 17. Marco Polo did not return from China carrying the sacred gift of pasta to a noodleless Italy. Italians were already eating pasta long before he was born. Records from the 12th century mention pasta in Italy, and Polo's travels happened later, so the timeline alone makes the legend collapse like cheap furniture. The myth probably survived because people love neat origin stories, especially when they sound exotic and trade route flavored. Polo did describe foods he saw in Asia, including forms of noodles, but that is not the same as inventing or importing Italian pasta culture. Different societies arrived at similar ideas because mixing grain with water and cooking it is not exactly an impossible intellectual leap. Humans in multiple places figured that out all on their own. Italy does not need Marco Polo to explain pasta any more than bread needs a celebrity spokesperson. He traveled. Pasta was already home. 18. The Wild West was not a non-stop parade of masked bank robbers kicking in doors every Tuesday afternoon. That version was built by movies because movies need action, not statistical boredom. In the real American frontier, confirmed bank robberies were surprisingly rare. Over the classic Wild West period, there were very few of them, certainly nowhere near enough to justify the myth's dominance. Why so uncommon? Because robbing a bank in a small western town was almost a suicide plan. The bank sat in plain view, townspeople were armed, escape routes were limited, and pauses formed fast. Outlaws who tried it often ended up dead or captured in short order. Famous robbers stood out precisely because they were exceptions, not standard-issue frontier behavior. Hollywood turned a rare crime into the era's defining image because cattle accounting and ordinary lawlessness do not sell tickets nearly as well. 19. George Washington did not wear one of those towering powdered wigs people instinctively imagine when they see 18th century portraits. That white hair look was mostly his actual hair, grown out and styled according to elite fashion of the time. He powdered it, yes, which helps explain why he looks like every formal portrait is seconds away from shedding flour. But powdered hair was not automatically a wig. Wealthy men often did wear wigs, so the confusion is understandable. Yet Washington generally preferred using his own hair and managing it carefully. Naturally, it was reddish-brown, not bright white. The white appearance came from the powdering process, which involved grease, pomade, and powdered starch. It was expensive, inconvenient, and gloriously messy, which is probably why that trend did not age well. So no, the man was not hiding under a fake hair helmet. He was just very committed to high-maintenance fashion. 20. The Founding Fathers did not all gather on July 4th, strike heroic poses, and sign the Declaration of Independence together like they were filming the closing scene of a patriotic blockbuster. July 4th was the day Congress approved the text. That is important, but it is not the same thing as every delegate instantly marching up to the parchment in unison. The actual signing unfolded over time. The formal engrossed copy was prepared later, and signatures were added gradually as delegates were present and available. Some men associated with the document were not even there on July 4th. John Hancock's giant signature became legendary, but the idea of one synchronized national autograph session is pure mythology. The real process was slower, messier, and deeply administrative, which is honestly how committee politics usually works. Independence got approved on July 4th. The signatures arrived on history's favorite bureaucratic schedule. 21. The Aztecs did not greet Hernan Cortez like he was a returning god descending from prophecy with perfect timing and a colonial approval rating. That story was largely built later by Spanish writers who had excellent reasons to make the conquest sound inevitable, divinely flavored, and somehow less like an invasion supported by disease, alliances, and violence. Contemporary indigenous sources do not back the idea that Cortez was mistaken for Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs were not naive fools wandering into their own collapse because they mistook armored foreigners for sky beings. They were experienced political actors facing a dangerous new enemy and trying diplomacy, calculation, and caution under impossible circumstances. That is what states do when an unfamiliar armed power appears. The god story survived because victors love narratives that make conquest seem destined. It turns military brutality into myth and strips the defeated of intelligence. 22. That famous story about NASA wasting millions on a pen while the sensible Soviets just used pencils is one of those smug little myths people repeat because it sounds too satisfying to fact-check. In reality, both the Americans and the Soviets used pencils early on, and both had good reasons to move away from them. In zero gravity, pencil fragments and graphite dust can float around the cabin. That is a serious problem because graphite conducts electricity, and loose conductive particles near sensitive equipment inside a sealed spacecraft are a terrible idea. The so-called space pen was not a giant government vanity project either. It was developed privately, then sold to both programs. The Soviets bought them too, quite happily. So the real lesson is not that one side was foolish and the other clever. The real lesson is that floating pencil debris is a dumb thing to gamble with in space. 23. The story of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances in World War II is propaganda so effective it somehow graduated into fake history. Polish cavalry units were not suicidal medieval leftovers galloping at armored vehicles because nobody had briefed them on the 20th century. They were modern troops who used horses mainly for mobility, especially across terrain where vehicles struggled. Once in position, they fought on foot with proper weapons, including machine guns and anti-tank gear. The myth grew from a real clash in 1939 where Polish cavalry attacked German infantry successfully, and later journalists saw dead horses near armored vehicles that arrived afterward. Nazi and fascist propagandists shaped that image into a tale about primitive Poles charging tanks with sabers and lances. It made the invasion look like modern genius, crushing backward stupidity. Dramatic story, yes. Accurate military history, absolutely not. 24. Medieval Europeans were not dumping expensive spices onto rotten meat because their taste buds had apparently signed a death wish. That myth falls apart the second you apply basic economics. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg were luxury imports that traveled enormous distances and cost a fortune. Only wealthy households could afford them regularly, and people wealthy enough to buy imported spices were also wealthy enough to buy fresh meat. The poor, who might actually have needed help disguising spoiled food, could not afford those spices in the first place. So the whole idea makes no sense. Rich diners used spices because they liked them and because serving heavily seasoned dishes signaled status, reach, and money. It was culinary display, not edible emergency management. The rotten meat myth survived because later generations looked at unfamiliar medieval flavors and assumed everyone in the past must have been absurdly gross. 25. Paul Revere did not gallop through the night screaming, "The British are coming!" like he was auditioning for the loudest possible role in revolutionary theater. First, the mission was meant to be discreet. He was warning Patriot leaders about British troop movements, not hosting an open-air spoiler event for every farmhouse within hearing distance. Second, saying the British would have been odd anyway because the colonists still considered themselves British subjects at that stage. He likely would have used terms like regulars. Third, the famous ride is not even as clean and heroic as legend suggests, because Revere was captured before finishing the mission. Other writers, especially Samuel Prescott, helped get the warning through. Revere became the superstar later because literature picked him. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow turned him into the main character, and poetry, as usual, was more interested in drama than fairness. 26. The Spanish flu was not Spanish. Spain just had the misfortune of being honest while everyone else was busy censoring reality. In 1918, the First World War was still raging, and countries at war had strong incentives to suppress news about a lethal disease ripping through soldiers and civilians. Public morale mattered, military image mattered, and newspapers in combatant nations were heavily restricted. Spain, being neutral, reported openly on the outbreak, including high-profile cases involving the king. So to the outside world, Spain looked like the center of the disaster simply because Spain was the one country not pretending nothing was wrong. Early evidence points elsewhere, with serious attention often given to outbreaks linked to military camps in Kansas before the disease spread widely through troop movements. Spain did not create the pandemic. It got stuck with the name because it committed the unforgivable crime of transparency. 27. High heels started as men's gear, which is one of history's funniest little fashion reversals. They were first useful for Persian cavalry, where a raised heel helped keep a rider's foot secure in the stirrup while shooting from horseback. In other words, the original high heel was not about elegance, seduction, or runway attitude. It was practical equipment for mounted warfare, basically tactical footwear with flair. When Persian styles reached Europe in the 17th century, aristocrats saw the look and immediately did what aristocrats do best: copy power and turn it into status fashion. Noblemen started wearing heels because they looked commanding, expensive, and a bit superior. Louis XIV took this to absurdly enthusiastic levels, wearing dramatic heeled shoes to boost both height and royal presence. Women adopted heels later. So yes, one of fashion's most gendered symbols began as a military tool for men. 28. The classic wide-brimmed cowboy hat is so tied to the American West that it feels illegal to question it. But real working cowboys often wore something less dramatic. The bowler hat, also called the derby, was extremely common and in many cases more practical. It fit tighter, stayed on better in wind, handled rough use well, and did not fly off every time weather decided to get theatrical. The famous Stetson existed and did gain popularity, but it was not automatically the dominant everyday choice during the actual frontier years people romanticize. Hollywood helped crown it king because wide brims and tall crowns create a strong silhouette. On camera, it screams Western instantly. Real cowboys, meanwhile, were not styling for close-ups. They cared about durability, fit, and not having their hat vanish across the prairie because a gust of wind wanted a souvenir. 29. Ponce de Leon was not wandering around Florida like a confused tourist looking for a magical anti-aging fountain. He was a conquistador, which means he was after the usual package: wealth, land, influence, and control. Gold, titles, territory, labor, and political advancement were the real goals, not enchanted skincare. The Fountain of Youth story appears later and seems to have been pushed by writers with motives that were not exactly generous. One rival chronicler in particular helped spread the tale decades after Ponce de Leon's death, making him sound like a gullible fool chasing fantasy instead of the far more familiar reality of a hard, ambitious colonial operator. The legend survived because it is colorful and weird, which is better for storytelling than saying he wanted power like every other conquistador in sight. It also helped later tourism immensely, which is a whole separate layer of irony. 30. Charles Lindbergh was not the first human to cross the Atlantic by air. He was the first to do it solo and non-stop, which is genuinely astonishing and already impressive enough without editing other people out of the story. In 1919, 8 years before Lindbergh's famous flight, John Alcock and Arthur Brown flew non-stop from Newfoundland to Ireland. They pulled it off, won a prize, and received huge recognition at the time. So the Atlantic had absolutely been crossed before Lindbergh ever climbed into his aircraft. What made his 1927 flight historic was that he did it alone, in a single-engine plane, with no co-pilot to share the burden, for more than 33 exhausting hours. That deserves admiration. But popular memory flattened the achievement into something broader and less accurate. Lindbergh was first in one extraordinary category, not first in the entire sky-crossing story. 31. Prehistoric humans were not all living in caves like gloomy Stone Age tenants waiting for fire insurance to be invented. Most of them were mobile hunter-gatherers following animals, seasons, and available resources. That kind of life works better with temporary shelters built from wood, hides, brush, and whatever the environment offered. Caves were useful sometimes, but they were not ideal permanent homes. They were dark, damp, smoky, and often already occupied by creatures with a very different concept of shared housing. So why does everyone picture cavemen? Because caves preserve evidence incredibly well. Paintings, bones, tools, and traces of human activity can survive there for ages, while outdoor campsites usually vanish under weather and time. Archaeology ends up finding more cave material, and popular imagination turns that survival bias into lifestyle. Caves mattered, yes, but caveman is a catchy lie built from uneven evidence. 32. Medieval Europeans did not believe the Earth was flat unless they were unusually uneducated or just having a very ambitious bad day. Scholars in the Middle Ages knew the planet was spherical. This was not hidden secret knowledge either. It had been argued by ancient thinkers long before, and those ideas continued circulating through education and religious scholarship. The famous debate around Columbus was never really about whether he would sail off the edge of the world like a man testing a dinner plate. The real argument was over distance. Columbus badly underestimated the size of the globe, while his critics were far closer to reality and warned that the journey to Asia westward was too long to survive with the available supplies. He was not vindicated by genius. He was rescued by continents he did not expect. The flat Earth medieval myth was invented much later to make the past look dumber. So, which of these lies annoyed you the most? And what historical fact are people still repeating that deserves to be publicly humiliated next? Drop the most overrated myth we missed in the comments and defend your pick like your reputation depends on it. If you want more history getting its mask ripped off, hit like, subscribe, and stick around.